Welcome back to Viewpoint. I'm Jim Zogby. My co-host with me is Maya Berry. Our next guest is Mike German, Policy Counsel for National Security and Privacy at the American Civil Liberties Union's Washington Legislative Office. 16-year veteran of law enforcement, served as FBI Special Agent and as counterterrorism instructor at the FBI National Academy. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
Thanks for having me.
There's a couple things I want to talk to you about, and Maya's going to discuss with you the issue of surveillance and profiling. But I want to start on this mapping exercise. I have seen the NYPD, the locations of interest books. I described them at one point as looking like what the Syrian secret police might put together. Photographs of all the places people eat and shop and hang out. It's a national exercise, though, being done by the FBI.
Right.
From what I saw, can I assume that when other localities do these, that they're pretty much the same? A picture of the city with all the little dots of where interest locations are, and then photographs and little bits of information about each one. Is that what we get?
We did a nationwide Freedom of Information Act project to try to get these maps, and what we received are the maps with the map completely blocked out, but often just the titles. So sometimes the title will just say ethnic groups, and the map obviously, although it's completely redacted in the version we're given, obviously would identify where these different ethnic groups live. Yeah. There's one map that we have from Tennessee that actually says mosques and Islamic centers. So, clearly it's similar activity. It's hard to know because we don't have the actual documents what exactly those maps look like. But clearly the FBI's purpose in identifying where these communities are to treat them differently than they treat other communities, to either focus their scrutiny within those communities or somehow do more surveillance or otherwise engage in other investigative activity in those neighborhoods.
So you have local police departments doing it. You have FBI doing it. Is there cooperation or redundancy?
I think it's a little of both. I think, part of the intelligence world is that there's such secrecy around it that everybody assumes the other agency is doing more and therefore we should do something to catch up. Without ever really acknowledging that maybe the other agency isn't doing that. We saw in 2007 the Los Angeles Police Department announced a Muslim mapping program that, because it was announced publicly, was very quickly shut down due to the public outrage. But here we come to find that the FBI was just at that same time ramping up their own mapping program. And to be clear, their mapping program is actually much broader, not just broader in geographic area, but we have maps and these domain management assessments of black populations in Georgia in a purported effort to look for the black separatist threat, Latino communities in New Jersey and Georgia and Alabama in an attempt to look for the threat from MS-13. So it's as if for every racial group, the FBI would make some crass racial stereotype, that Latinos are involved with MS-13, and then use that to justify identifying and targeting the entire Latino community.
Here's what intrigues me. I mean, I looked at the book, the NYPD one. It's the only one we've seen. And as scary as it was, intrusive, and you almost felt, violated. Places you shop and eat in restaurants and stuff, photographs and little tidbits about conversations overheard and what TV station was on in the place, etc. But it was also banal and trite, and in some places just downright silly. I mean, one might ask, with the mapping, it already exists. It's called the Yellow Pages. I mean, I'm not quite sure what was in there that was worth the informants who were suborned into helping compile it, or the agents who were sent undercover into the field to do it. I mean, did I miss something? Is there some actual value to these things, or is this an exercise that they maybe hope will be leaked so that people will feel intimidated?
The FBI special agent in charge in Newark said exactly the same thing, that investigations that aren't based on articulable, individualized suspicion are worthless, and produce information that's not helpful to the investigation. Marcy Wheeler, who writes for a blog called Empty Wheel, did a great analysis of that NYPD reports and determined that some known terrorists, people who were later uncovered as terrorists, Zazi and Shahzad with the Times Square bomber, were both within the communities that the NYPD was mapping and surveilling, and yet they were not identified through that process. So, you should be worried both that these resources are targeting completely innocent people and producing information that isn't helpful and is actually getting in the way of and impeding serious law enforcement efforts.
One of the things that I found humorous was that the location of interest book on the Egyptians has a whole bunch of demographic pages in the beginning, taken completely from our website, but they are the very pages that we threw out because the methodology that was used to compile them was false, and we found that they were misleading numbers, but they're still in the NYPD book on here's the numbers of the Arabs, blah, blah, blah. I mean, and I looked at it and I said, if that indicates the level of the intelligence that went into putting this together, then we're in trouble.
Right, and the Associated Press also did great reporting on it, where they talked to some of the individuals who were documented in these reports. And one gentleman said, they're correct that I'm Syrian, but I'm actually a Christian and not a Muslim. And they could have come in and asked me, and I could have given them the correct information. But they didn't. They instead used this surreptitious method of gathering intelligence, and what we find from that is that it produces bad intelligence. You make bad assumptions based on people's ethnicity or nationality or national origin, and that leads to bad assumptions. But once that information goes in the intelligence system, it can never be corrected. There's no process for reviewing it and making sure it's correct. So actual harm can come to people who are incorrectly identified in these intelligence reports as being aligned with some group or other that they're not.
So this is the nexus between profiling and surveillance in its crudest form. And I'm going to switch over to you on the issue of the profiling and surveillance issues.
I want to just on the note about New York, Congressman Peter King recently during a press interview on NYPD and what was happening, and particularly New Jersey's complaint in terms of the jurisdictional issues, so we're happy to have complaints at least that question this. But in the interview, he took issue with the journalist who asked him a question on the point about this being profiling. He was very adamant, this is not in fact profiling, which is, of course, not surprising given Congressman King's sort of attitudes and perceptions about this. But there is, presumably, in our own government, Department of Justice does not allow profiling. So how is it that, sort of a big picture piece on this, how is all of this happening with federal dollars?
It's a great question. In 2002, Attorney General John Ashcroft purported to ban profiling in the federal government and issued guidance that was supposed to implement that. The problem with the guidance was it had huge loopholes. One is it didn't include religion, it just included race and ethnicity, or national origin for that matter. And the second was that it had an exception for national security and border integrity investigations. And what we see in the FBI's racial mapping program, it was actually authorized in December of 2008, but the documents show that they were actually doing it before it was authorized in the changed Attorney General guidelines in 2008. But it really got going in 2009. So, this is actually something that is fairly recent that they're doing. And it is based on this crass racial profiling, where it's literally, we have a document from San Francisco that says, Chinese people have been engaged in organized crime for decades, therefore we're going to map the entire Chinese community in San Francisco. And that is really what we have called racial profiling on an industrial scale. It's not just stopping the one person because he's Chinese driving down the street, but rather we're going to use law enforcement resources to focus on identifying where all the Chinese in San Francisco live.
The point about law enforcement resources would, I would think, to any sort of average person be the first flag to go up on any of this, which is that it actually costs a lot of money. You made the point, Jim, about some of the ridiculous information in here. It takes a lot of man hours to sort of find out what your favorite travel agency is or where the best bakery is in these neighborhoods. How is it playing out now that this information's all sort of becoming public to us? These FOIAs are producing these documents. Has there been sort of an evaluation of whether this is useful? And on the second point is, if it's not sort of just public discourse, what have congressional members done in terms of oversight on this?
There hasn't been any evaluation of whether it's useful. I mean, and I think that goes to all of these post 9/11 intelligence authorities, whether it's the Patriot Act or the FISA amendments. And what we get instead are small episodes where there's either some leak to the newspaper or some inspector general investigation or congressional hearing that exposes some wrongdoing. Typically, they'll go in and do an investigation. When that happened with the FBI's national security letters, for instance, what you find is widespread abuse. And when you look at trying to identify how it's helpful, the Inspector General was able to find one terrorism prosecution that relied on national security letters. And that was based on mere reporting. In other words, he just went to the FBI and said, show me the cases where this has been valuable. And they weren't able to provide more than one terrorism prosecution that was related to it. And they have since said, oh, this is our bread and butter. But when you do an evaluation, it's not just based on somebody's statement about that it's great. You actually have to look at the data, and typically they find it's not very helpful. Same with the FISA amendments. When the Inspector Generals looked at that and actually talked to agents, very few said that the material obtained through these methods was worthwhile.
The Pulitzer Prize winning team at the AP has been responsible for getting so much of this information out there. I want to ask you a bit about specifically the training manuals. And we've got a slide of what I think is one of sort of the core issues. This is from a PowerPoint presentation that was used during the training manuals, and it makes the point about conducting surveillance as part of the outreach efforts of the FBI and the Department of Justice and others. So if you could help us, the keys to proactive approach. So you're first knowing the culture, those all make sense, and then you get into the aggressive, innovative investigation of the piece, and they're hand in hand. If you could help us understand, as someone who spent years at the agency, do you ever get to a point where there can be an understanding of how that very approach is at the heart of the problem?
I think it's very clearly at the heart of the problem, and you know, this is not a new problem for law enforcement. You know, as long as law enforcement has had intelligence powers, they've abused them. And you know, the latest major examination of that was the Church Committee, the Senate committee to investigate the FBI's COINTELPRO program, which was used to spy on the civil rights movement, anti-war movement, among others. And it utilized this same approach. So guidelines were put in place to restrict the FBI to working on investigations and using their most intrusive techniques in areas where they had a reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Well, those guidelines have been watered down over the years, most significantly in 2002 after 9/11, and then again in 2008, and have opened the door to this type of activity. So one of the documents we obtained talks about conducting these assessments, and this is a new investigative authority the FBI was given in 2008 that requires no factual predicate. Not just that we don't have to have evidence that the people that are being investigated have done anything wrong, but that anybody has done anything wrong. Literally no factual predicate. It just requires the agent to tell himself that he is working on something to protect national security or to prevent crime. And then he can conduct a very intrusive investigation using informants, conducting interviews, both covert and overt, 24/7 surveillance, you know, the same types of things we're seeing in these other abusive cases. So a lot of this is because the rules have opened the door, and what happens is they spend a lot of time investigating things where there is no threat, and you know, where there isn't any evidence or indication, you know, factual indication something's wrong. Typically, that's not going to be a very fruitful place to be exercising if you're a law enforcement officer. And that's what I found during my career, that the standard of reasonable suspicion was actually very helpful to get me to focus on people who were really doing harm. And I would tell young agents, if you can't sit down with a paper and write down what laws you think this person is violating and why, there's probably somebody worse out there. You know, and you should maybe focus your attention on them, because it's simply going to allow you to go down these rabbit holes. And part of the FBI's culture now is this: no lead goes uncovered. Well, it's impossible to prove that somebody isn't something, right? It's impossible to prove the negative. So these investigations become more and more time-consuming as you can't find evidence to legitimize the investigation. You keep digging for more. So the FBI instituted what they call a disruption strategy, and we have a document that explains this, that after the investigation is over, even if the threat is resolved, they can then engage in other activities to disrupt the activities of the target. And that sort of tying all this together is where the training is a problem, because if the training suggests that all Muslims are a problem, or any other group, we have training about anarchists, about the animal rights movement, about a bunch of different groups. But if the training suggests that it's the ideology or religion that is the problem, the policy now allows, even where you can't find evidence of a crime, to come back and do more intrusive investigation.
And that therein lies the problem. Bad training creates the context for this kind of intelligence debacle that we're in. I mean, I wonder how you unwind that, because we've been trying to get the FBI to be more open about the training program. They tell us 800 pages out of 100 and something thousand pages have been removed, but they won't show us what was removed, what was in, and so we don't really have a sense of what the programs actually look like and how people are being trained.
Right, and to their credit, they did the review and they did identify materials that they're taking out. There does need to be a lot more transparency, so everybody has faith that that review was done properly and all of the bad training is taken out. But the problem is there are intelligence products that are disseminated broadly throughout the law enforcement community that are based on some of that training, and we actually wrote a letter that was signed by a number of other groups to Director Mueller, asking him to review those intelligence products too, because they have a life, and a law enforcement officer receives one of these reports and puts it on his desk and can refer to it over and over again. And unless those are withdrawn as well, you're going to have the same problems continuing to come up. But so far, the FBI has refused to examine the intelligence products.
On the training programs, there is this sort of official FBI training program set of manuals that have been now revealed, but there are these other programs that we've recently become aware of. I mean, within the last year, I have a booklet here done by the Political Research Associates called Manufacturing the Muslim Menace, which talks about private institutions or for-profit institutions that actually are training local police departments and other law enforcement agencies, and doing it on federal funds, and involving some of the very people who are part of this Islamophobia network as the trainers, which becomes rather frightening. Where is the ACLU on that, and is there a lever to be pulled on the the federal dollars going into support for these kinds of programs?
Sure, and the ACLU at its heart is a First Amendment organization. Of course, we would defend the rights of anybody to speak out on whatever their beliefs are. But when it comes to the government promoting different viewpoints, that's where it becomes a problem. And part of what we're trying to do is expose what is being trained, because this information that's out there in the public domain, FBI agents are people too. So even if they don't receive it through official training, they can see it in the public domain and have to actually be trained to know what is true and what isn't. And to a certain extent, terrorism studies as a discipline has long suffered from a political problem. I mean, terrorism is defined separate from regular crime by its political motives. So because there's politics sort of in the definition, you have politics in the response. And a lot of times you have people who are trying to use a group's use of violence as a justification for denouncing the entire political viewpoint that they present, rather than just focusing on the people who are acting in an illegal manner. So it's a big problem, but the FBI really has to get control of it, because if the FBI is going out telling its own agents this, that's going to expand not just in formal programs, but in informal programs, and be part of what the basis they use for doing investigations, where now they don't need to show objective facts, this type of training can have an even worse impact. So it is a huge problem.
You made the point about individual discretion, that you really do now have very empowered individual agents. And if you look at the training manuals, the training these individuals are receiving, it's as if what is occurring in New York, what may be happening in Los Angeles, are sort of the logical consequences of how they've been trained.
Right.
So one of the issues that we've raised repeatedly with the FBI, in addition to the point about transparency and sort of how do you actually get the information once it's already been everywhere, and we really are dealing with it in multiple municipalities, state level, local, it is absolutely everywhere. What is also the retraining process? How do you sort of pull back from years of presenting this in a certain way? Right.
I think the first part is acknowledging what is erroneous training, which goes to your point about transparency. Unless the FBI publicly documents, this training was wrong, factually incorrect. There's questions of whether this is a political correctness movement. It's a factual correctness movement. And I think identifying what is wrong will help agents who are actively trying to learn about a problem to identify what is the appropriate material and what is inappropriate. But really what it takes is focusing on empirical evidence. And the terrorism researchers who actually go out and conduct empirical studies come to a far different conclusion from a lot of the terrorism experts who are based on sort of their ideas of what motivates people rather than actual evidence of what motivates them.
You mentioned the Patriot Act and the different provisions that were set up to sunlight, and then they've been renewed with very little examination still. And if anything, we've added drones to our new domestic surveillance program. Going into this election, I think there is a certain understanding that national security, at least civil liberties challenges to national security, aren't going to be particularly well received. But do you see in sort of our national discourse on this a pullback, because I think an average American looking at these reports would sort of be really uncomfortable for a variety of reasons, but one of them being this is incredibly un-American. This is just not what we do. How does that sort of, what has to happen for that to become part of our discourse? Less a national security conversation and more about a civil rights abuse.
I'm concerned that there are actually still movements in the wrong direction. Just recently the National Counterterrorism Center changed their guidelines without any public discussion to take away long-standing tradition of the military and intelligence community not spying on Americans and basically dissolve that, so that the National Counterterrorism Center now can collect what they call, under the technical term, non-terrorism U.S. person information. That means information about Americans that they know has no relationship with terrorism, and now can keep it for 5 years and do anything they want with it.
And are drones going to factor into this?
I think certainly drones are, because you have facial recognition technology that's advancing rapidly. So when you combine all these different technological platforms, you have the ability to further expand this suspicionless collection, which again pulls in a lot of information about innocent people, but doesn't help focus.
So 1984 took a little longer than was foreseen, but we're getting there.
Certainly, with the technological innovations and the permissive attitudes in Congress about providing the government this unchecked authority, you certainly have a perfect storm that is creating huge privacy and civil liberties problems.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's a very frightening message, but it's real and one we need to be concerned with. Thanks, Mike. That's all the time we've got. For information, you can follow us on Twitter at AAIUSA or log on to the website, aaiusa.org. I want to thank you for joining us, thank our guests, and we'll see you next week on Viewpoint.